Well, in our last PowerPoint video, we were talking about epithelial tissue. Epithelial, we know means covering or lining. But today, what we want to talk about is probably some of the more abundant tissues in the body, and that's called connective tissue. And guess what connective tissue does? Of course, it connects. So let's just talk a little about connective tissue, what it is, and stuff like that. Well, as we know, and we talked about last time, tissue is basically the word tissue implies it's a group of cells that have a similar origin. They function together to carry out some specific type of activity. And again, we have four different basic types of tissue: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. And again, we know that. So let's go on, and we're going to talk today about connective tissue, which is, really the most abundant tissue that we have in the body. And some of it will probably surprise you that you didn't think, well, I didn't think that'd be connective tissue, but you'll find out at the end it will. What happens is connective tissue differs from epithelial tissue in one large area, okay? Not just the fact that it connects things together, but what happens if I look at the tissues, what we find is connective tissue, when we looked at epithelial tissue, first of all, it was a bunch of cells that were tightly packed together. They were very close together, very short gaps between one cell to the other. There's a lot of cell-to-cell contact. Guess what? In connective tissue, that's not the case. We have a lot fewer cells and a lot of what we call matrix, okay? And these cells are scattered around through this matrix. This matrix is what makes the different types of connective tissue, okay? So basically what we do is we have cells, which are part of this whole system, but we have a lot what's called ground substance and fibers. Ground substance is sort of like, if you ever watch people put down cement, before they put down the cement, they make a frame, and then they put all these wire bars inside there. Then they pour, which is that rebar, and then they pour the cement. Well, basically, the wire bars are like the fibers that sort of hold things together, and the cement is like the ground substance. It sort of holds the wire bars, and the wire bars make the cement stronger. Okay, the rebar makes it stronger. So anyway, that's what connective tissue. It has fewer cells and lots of matrix. Fewer cells, lots of matrix, few cells, and they're very widely scattered. And when we show you some pictures of what they look like, you'll see, a lot of amorphous material, and then you'll see a cell here, cell there, cell there, cell there, and stuff like that. But they have this abundant intercellular ground substance or matrix. And this matrix depends upon where it is and what it's for, contains a lot of things. Some of the common things we see in matrix are one thing's called hyaluronic acid. If you watch commercials and they talk about all the moisturizing creams and stuff like that, and make all those wrinkles go away, add more moisture to your skin. Well, that's because of hyaluronic acid. Hyaluronic acid basically sort of allows the tissues and the cells to retain water. Okay, so it's basically for moisturizing, lubrication, and stuff like that to keep the cells, in a moist environment. Okay. Second thing we have frequently, especially in certain types of cartilage, is something called chondroitin sulfate. And chondroitin sulfate, you got to remember that what happens is if I have few cells but a lot of matrix, I have trouble getting the nutrients to the cells because they're sort of like sequestered in these small little compartments, okay? So what happens is the chondroitin sulfate is basically a material we find largely in things like cartilage, okay, that allows nutrients to be able to be delivered to the cells, because the cells still, regardless if there's fewer cells and they're isolated in different little pockets all over the place, what happens, they still need nutrients. Also, it inhibits, chondroitin sulfate inhibits enzyme destruction of the cartilage, okay? I know years ago when people were talking about trying to build strong cartilage and prevent cartilage wear and tear, particularly in athletes, they were taking chondroitin sulfate supplements to try to do that. And I don't know whether it really made much of a difference or anything like that, but that's chondroitin sulfate. We also have dermatan sulfate, okay? And what happens is this sort of is a material, more in skin, that actually binds cells to the various types of collagen or fibers that hold these cells together. It's sort of like a little bit of a Elmer's glue that holds things together a little bit. Keratin sulfate, I wouldn't worry too much about that. That's just another thing. We see it more in the cornea of the eye, and it provides a clear type of a connective material that will hold things together. Okay, so that's what we found in what we call ground substance. Ground substance is basically that type of material. Okay, that's the a lot of the material between the cells. What happens is in the midst of that's like the cement, like we talked about earlier, but in this ground substance, we have a lot of fibers, okay? And these fibers are produced by cells called fibroblasts. And what these fibroblasts do, they're small little cells, and they actually go out and they start to spit different types of fibers, okay? They start to make these different types of fibers. One common is collagen. You probably hear about collagen all the time when all these commercials for people wanting to rejuvenate the skin, collagen building, things like that. And in fact, you'll see people who have like cheekbones puffed up with little collagen injections and stuff like that. But anyway, that's what collagen is probably the most abundant. And it's just a fibrous material that holds things together. I'll show you some pictures of collagen in just a little bit. Elastic fibers, okay? Elastic fibers, but from elastin, basically are sort of wiggly. And we'll see this a lot in some elastic connective tissue. I'll show you what it looks like. Looks like a tray of lasagna with things piled up on top of each other. And then we also have reticular fibers, okay? And reticular fibers are also fibers that hold things together. I'll show you some reticular fibers a little bit later, okay? And again, the word that I used before was matrix, M-A-T-R-I-X, which we see down here. And matrix just means that ground substance, which is basically all this material right here, plus the fibers. And that's what constitutes most connective tissue. Lots of matrix, few fibers, or lots of matrix, few cells, excuse me. Lots of matrix, few cells. And that's what really sort of makes connective tissue, okay? Now, this is something that varies depending upon the location. Most connective tissue is pretty vascular, okay? However, there are some connective tissues that aren't. Cartilage and tendon are really not very vascular, okay? And you can probably see this in the sense that what happens is if somebody has a cartilage injury, how do they heal? That's right, they don't. They don't heal very well. Why? Because for things to heal, they need a good blood supply, okay? And because the cartilage doesn't really have a good blood supply, cartilage really can't repair itself, okay? So as a result, cartilage, frequently when it's destroyed, it's destroyed. When you look at people with arthritis, one of the problems with the typical wear and tear arthritis, or what we call osteoarthritis, is just that over years, with one bone rubbing against the other, it wears away the cartilage at the ends of the bones, and it wears that away. There's nothing to replenish it. There's nothing to bring it back. Why? Because there's not really a good vascular supply to cartilage, okay? Tendon is the same. When a tendon ruptures, if you're a sports fan, oh no, he ruptures Achilles tendon, he's going to be out for 6 months to 9 months. Well, the reason why it takes so long to get back is because the tendon doesn't have a very good blood supply. The blood supply is very poor, is exceptionally poor, and as a result, it takes a long time to heal. There's good news and bad news about that low blood supply. It means that with the low blood supply, there are fewer cells, so we don't need that much of a blood supply. But the bad news is that if you do injure it, takes a lot longer time to heal, okay? You'll see that with people with tendon type injuries. They're just a bear to heal. It takes a long time for those to heal. And why? Because they have a very poor vascular supply, okay? And connective tissue usually has nerve supply, with the exception of cartilage. Cartilage is relatively insensitive, okay? When people usually have a problem with a cartilage injury, it's because of other things that are occurring. The same thing like with arthritis, it's because of inflammation inside the joint, or it's because sometimes the cartilage is so worn down you actually have raw bone rubbing against raw bone, and bone is sensitive, okay? It does have nerve supply. So, but basically that's a little about the nerve supply. A couple things that if you've taken medical terminology, you know this. If you see a word that ends in blast, blast means an immature cell. It's not quite where it needs to be. It's still a youngster. It needs to grow up a lot. If you see the word site underneath that, and these are going to become a little bit more important when we talk about bone in a future discussion down the road. Site means a mature is the ending. It's a suffix of a mature cell, a grown-up cell that's an adult. Okay, so if you see blast, it means an immature cell. If you see site, it means a full-grown, fully developed, mature type of a cell. Now, what type of cells do we have? We have a number of different types of cells in this connective tissue. Again, probably the most common type of cell we have are fibroblasts. And these fibroblasts are basically cells that will secrete just different types of fibers, okay? Elastic fibers, reticular fibers, collagen fibers, and things such as that, okay? Second type of cell that we have are called histiocytes. histiocytes, okay? And histiocytes, what they are is they're called macrophages, okay? And they develop from a tissue, some cells called monocytes. Monocytes are actually blood cells, okay? Macro means big, phage or phage means to eat, okay? And these cells are really important. The histiocytes are really important in regulating the immune function and in connective tissue. So they're involved in both the defense of the connective tissue against invaders as well as repair, okay? They are largely involved in the inflammatory response. Now, inflammation you think is bad. You know, inflammation, you know, when things get irritated or if you injure something, it becomes inflamed. Well, inflammation is important and it's good, provided it's kept to a reasonable level, okay? And what produces this inflammation, which actually stimulates healing, are these histiocytes. These histiocytes actually help to stimulate that healing because of the inflammatory response that they have. Plasma cells. Plasma cells are important because what they do is they are factories for making antibodies. They develop from what are called B lymphocytes, which is another type of a blood cell. What happens in the blood, we make antibodies, okay? And the cells that make the antibodies, they become actually factories for making antibodies, are these B lymphocytes, which actually become what are called plasma cells, and the plasma cells are what makes the antibodies. So B cells, they grow up, they mature, and they're formed into what are called plasma cells. These plasma cells make antibodies. Mast cells. Mast cells produce a material called histamine. If you notice when something is injured, it will swell. The area gets red, it gets swollen, and that's part of that inflammatory response to bring in the histiocytes and other types of cells that will actually, and as well as the fibroblasts. So what happens is we need to increase the blood supply. And what happens is these mast cells, by histamine, what the histamine does is it causes a vasodilation. It causes the vessels to get larger. As a result, it allows an increased inflow of blood flow to that area. So therefore, you'll see if you see a histamine response, what you'll see is the area becomes red, it becomes swollen. That's because of an increased amount of blood flow that's there. It feels warmer as well because of the increased blood flow. When people have hives is basically an exaggerated histamine response, okay? So these mast cells have this material in there called histamine, and that histamine is a vasodilator that allows these inflammatory cells to come into the area for repair and stuff like that. We also have adipocytes. Well, adipose means fat, and these are cells that store fat. We'll talk a little bit about those. I'll show you some pictures of some adipocytes and how they store the fat and stuff like that. We also have leukocytes. Leukocytes are white blood cells. Leuko means white. We have a number of different types of white blood cells. I won't talk a lot about that today, but leukocytes basically have different functions, okay? There are a number of leukocytes. The most common is called a neutrophil, or polymorphonuclear leukocyte, okay? Or PMN, because people don't like to say polymorphonuclear because that's a little bit long word, okay? So as a result, these actually are the most common type of white blood cells we have, and they're very big infection fighters. We have lymphocytes, and lymphocytes are also important in the immune response because what happens is lymphocytes either can be what are called T lymphocytes, which actually will develop cells which will eat up debris and bad stuff, or B lymphocytes, and like we talked about B lymphocytes before, become plasma cells that actually will help to make the antibodies. We have basophils, and basophils also will have histamine in them. They're histamine releasers. Eosinophils we see in allergy, parasitic infections, and we'll see that. And so if you watch one commercial about people with asthma, they'll say high eosinophil count. Well, guess what? Most people with asthma have what? Allergies, of course. So as a result, what happens is that and these eosinophils are high in the cases of people with allergy. And we have monocytes. And monocytes we talked about those before, they're eaters. Basically, they are indiscriminate eaters. They just like to eat a lot of stuff. Okay, and so those are some of the cells that we'll see in connective tissue. Okay, embryonic tissue. Embryonic tissue is basically tissue which is more like stem cells. Okay, and stem cells. This is a word you should probably know. Pluripotent. Okay, I just should have wrote that in something other than yellow because that doesn't really show very well. But anyway, pluripotent. And pluripotent means that these stem cells could be a lot of things. They could develop into a lot of different directions. So if I have a pluripotent cells, that means it could be bone, it could be whatever the case may be. It has multiple. It could The word we have here is called differentiation. Differentiation means what happens to have a stem cell or a baby, and it doesn't know what it wants to be when it grows up, but as it grows up, it gets influenced, and as it gets influenced, it starts to develop into a certain type of a profession, an X-ray tech or whatever the case may be. I don't know. By the way, that means it's pluripotent. It could be whatever it wants to be, and so these embryonic tissues, basically with those stem cells, are basically cells that will uh, develop into whatever they want to be. And mesenchyme basically are some of this embryonic stem cell type of material that develops into connective tissue. Okay. One other thing down here, and I just put it down here for the heck of it, is mucus connective tissue, or Wharton's jelly. What we find is Wharton's jelly is found in one place. Usually, it's in the umbilical cord. Okay. And most of us, I know I lost my umbilical cord 70 years ago, so I really can't think too much about it. But in an umbilical cord, there's a gooey material that's inside there, and that is filled with all kinds of stem cells. So like sometimes people talk about using that as a stem cell harvesting area from the area of the umbilical cord. Okay, and that's basically what we see with what's called Wharton's jelly, but I wouldn't worry too much about that in adults. And let me get rid of this pluripotent here because we know that. And again, this just shows that what happens is if I look at this tissue right here, you see a few cells and stuff like that. We'll talk more about that as time goes on. We'll talk about the different types of connective tissue. This is a better image of what we're talking about with connective tissue. If I really look at this area right here, what happens is I see cells. I see cells here. You know, you can make out where these little cells are all over the place. Okay, different types of cells, and there's fibroblasts. Here's a fibroblast up in there. And that's, you can see the nucleus, so there's going to be a little bit more cytoplasm around the outside. So those are the cells. Here's cells here. These are cells here. Cells. But what you see here is you see them, they're all scattered. They're all over the place. What do I see? I see more fibers. Okay, I see all these little fibers all over the place. And those little fibers are basically what holds things together. Okay, and if you look at all the empty spots in here, all the bare areas, that's filled with all that other types of matrix material that will the ground substance, the amorphous fluid stuff, the hyaluronic acid or the chondroitin sulfate and stuff like that, that fills all these other open areas inside there. So what we see with connective tissue, and I think that both of these images actually showed quite well, is the number of cells. They're not tightly packed like we saw in epithelial tissue, but they're spread out over larger areas, and they're held together by all these fibers and this amorphous material that sort of fills in all the gaps between all that. And that's what we see with connective tissue. Well, let's talk about some individual types of connective tissue here, okay? And we'll see where we go from here. First is areolar connective tissue. Now, areolar means it's like it sounds. Areolar means airy, okay? They have many cells. They're loosely woven, but they're still sort of like spread out, okay? Basically, this areolar tissue is a combination of, collagenous, elastic, and reticular fibers, but their cells are scattered around, and there's still a lot of amorphous type of ground substance that sort of sits between all that. Okay, where do we see these? We see this like in mucous membranes, subcutaneous layer around organs. Okay, they provide some level of strength, elasticity, and support. I know that you probably haven't had your hands in any kind of living body, inside. But what happens a lot of times? What happens is with this loose connective tissue, this loose areolar tissue, sometimes you don't need to cut it. Okay, what we used to do is sometimes is if you're going around an area, sometimes you just take your fingers and you can actually sort of like just separate it or spread it, because it holds things together, yes, but not like a really tight, really closely strong type of a situation. So you can actually sometimes take your fingers and spread, or sometimes you take an instrument like a hemostat and keep the ends closed, put it in between there and just open it, and that's just enough pressure to be able to cause this loose areolar tissue to connect. Okay, so that's called loose areolar tissue. And again, this is sort of a diagram up on the upper right that you see, where you see cells are scattered around a lot of tissue, almost like the two pictures we saw before. And here we go, we're back to the same thing. These are different. But what happens is we do see, there are cells here, but most of what we see are these fibers. We see a lot of fibers, and all the clear area between the fibers is all that ground substance material that sits inside there. Okay, and if you look at it, it's sort of like loose, okay? It's not tightly packed. When you start to see some later images, you see how some things are very tightly packed, but this is sort of like spread out. It's very, very loose. So that's why they call it loose areolar connective tissue. Areolar, airy, okay? A lot of open space in there. Wide open spaces between all these fibers and cells and stuff like that. That's called loose areolar connective tissue. Again, you know, if you have like a roast or something like that, you know, so you go out and, well, I guess meat, you know, with the pandemic is getting a little bit more scarce. But if you have like a big hunk of beef or something like that, sometimes you can actually take your fingers and go inside, but where you see like a little plane between different types of bundles of muscle, you can actually take it and you just separate it. You just pull it apart. And was connected together. Yes, it was, but it was connected together by this loose areolar connective tissue. Okay. Adipose tissue. Adipose, like I mentioned, means fat. Okay, and adipose tissue is basically for the storage of triglycerides, which are basically neutral fats. Okay, some people have more adipose, some people have less adipose tissue. Okay, and we see this in what's called the subcutaneous level or subcutaneous layer of tissue or skin. Just below the surface of the skin, there's going to be fat. Okay. Also, it's around organs and stuff like that. It's in a bone, in bone marrow. Some of the marrow is called yellow marrow, and yellow marrow basically doesn't make any blood cells. Red marrow is able to produce blood cells. Yellow marrow is basically, you know what it is? It's fat. That's pretty much what it is. Okay. What does this adipose tissue do? It provides some insulation. Okay. Because of the fat, it does provide an insulating barrier. A little bit of support, so things can be held up by fatty capsules around. If you look at the kidney we'll talk about a lot later on, but the kidneys don't bounce up and down. They're not like they're like two little things that are bouncing up and down, but they're actually held to the backside of the abdominal wall, and they're covered with fat. They're covered with fat, and they're held together with some dense connective tissue around the outside side of a capsule. So that fat provides some protection to it, plus it sort of holds it in a little pocket. Okay, so it does provide some support, does provide some protection, as well as energy reserve. What happens is we have a couple different types of fat. Brown fat versus yellow or white fat. Brown fat is actually could be used a lot for energy, okay? And it produces a lot of heat because the energy it can be used for also produces a good amount of heat. Yellow fat and white fat is sort of like the bad fat, you know, the stuff that everybody says I got a little bit too much yellow fat or white fat. You want to try to get rid of that stuff a lot, okay? And that's a little bit more difficult to get rid of, okay? Because it's not used as exuberantly as the brown fat for energy sources. And what we see with fat is we actually look like bubbles. If you look on the underneath the microscope, it looks like bubbles. You'll see these large open areas. Okay. Very little bit of a cell on the side. You'll see a little nucleus on the side, but most of it is going to be there's the little adipocyte right there, but it contains this large open area, which is basically filled with lipid, like an oily-like material. So this is what we see. Now over here, this area is fat right here. That's a little bit of fat right there. A little fat right here. This is fat right here. So these are all fat cells. All those open area bubble areas basically are the fat cells. And that's all filled with a lipid, oily material that's inside the triglycerides and stuff like that. And what we see is on the side, you see the little nucleus of the adipocyte sitting right in there. All those little dark spots are all the nuclei. You see them right there, the adipocytes, there's nuclei. And basically, these are all just filled with like an oil. And so if you take a piece of fat, you put it down on a table, and you rub it with your finger, it'll be oily. And you're actually squeezing and you're breaking all these little bubbles, those little fat bubbles, and you're squeezing all that oil out, okay? You're emulsifying it. So basically that's all that stored lipid material in all these little containers inside these adipocytes. So we have the cell, which is a large circle that stores the lipid inside, and that's called adipose connective tissue. That's called adipose connective tissue, okay? Loose. Now, when we look at another type of a loose connective tissue, loose means it's that's sort of like separated. It's the fibers aren't really tightly packed. Okay, we have what's called reticular tissue, okay? And this is mostly what I call reticular fibers. They stain a little bit darker usually, okay? And what happens, we find this reticular connective tissue, loose connective tissue in the liver, spleen, and lymph nodes. And basically it forms what's called the stroma of organs. What do I mean by stroma? We have cells inside of an organ that do certain types of things, that have a certain function, but they're really held together and united by stroma. It's basically all those other types of tissue that holds things together. So this reticular tissue is basically what holds all the functional cells of a particular organ, such as the liver, the spleen, or lymph nodes together. Okay. Also helps to bind smooth muscle cells. We'll talk more about smooth muscle in the next video in regards to tissue. Okay. So when we look at this, you'll see all these the little black fibers in there. Those little black fibers are called reticular fibers. They stain dark. A better picture here. Actually, this is a little bit different stain, so you don't see them. But if you look, they're still a little bit more purple. So if you look, you know, let me just do the smaller little things here. You see all these little squiggly lines in there? All these little squiggly lines are small little reticular fibers. Those are little reticular fibers all over the place, and they're spread all. I mean, they're all over the place. I just drew a couple, you know. So it's all this. So we see some cells. Okay, the dark spots are the nuclei of certain cells. But what happens is they're held together by all this little squiggly material all over, and that's called loose reticular tissue. Basically, we don't find the cells that we see are the cells of a particular organ. Okay, but what we see that holds them together is this loose reticular tissue, which are basically the fibers that hold things together. Okay, and that's what we see in loose reticular tissue. Okay, a lot of those little squirrely little fibers are there. We also have what's called dense connective tissue. Okay, dense connective tissue can be divided into two ways: irregular, and guess what the other one would be? Oh, of course, regular. So let's talk about dense irregular connective tissue. When we talked about the areolar, loose areolar tissue, we saw these fibers were all over the place. They're sort of haphazard. They're in multiple different areas. When we talk about dense, these fibers become much more condensed. They're much more held together. Okay, so we have in dense irregular connective tissue, there's an irregular weaving of all these collagen fibers. Okay, we find this in fascia. What's fascia? Fascia is like, if you look at a muscle is actually in a bag. That bag is called the, quote, fascial bag. It's sort of like a dense connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue. It's around that holds it together. Okay, so we find this dense irregular connective tissue in fascia, in the dermis, which is below the epidermis. Epidermis, outside the skin layer. We found the layer below that actually gives us a little bit more structure of the skin is a lot of this dense irregular connective tissue. The periosteum. Peri means around, osteo means bone, and around the bone there's a membrane that actually stimulates bone growth, and that's called the periosteum. And this is a lot of dense irregular connective tissue. Perichondrium, which is around cartilage. The joint capsule. Joint capsule actually holds two ends of bone together. Okay, organ membrane, organ capsule that holds an organ together that gives it its shape. Heart valves. The heart valves, we'll talk a lot about the heart valves later on. Valves that allow one-way flow through the heart are a lot of this dense irregular connective tissue. Because the fibers are woven closely, okay, it provides strength. And that's what we see with this dense irregular connective tissue. And again, you know, look it up there. That's not a great picture. Let me show you a better one. If we look here, okay, what happens is all this material in here, if you see those dots, those are cells, but everything that's inside there is everything. If you sort of like eliminate all those little dots, those little cellular dot areas, everything, all that pinkish material there is this irregular, dense irregular connective tissue. Fibers that are closely and densely packed together. They provide a tight weave and a tight connection to hold all these cells together, and that's called dense irregular connective tissue. Why is it irregular? Because I don't see any real particular scheme to this. The tissue is sort of like, it looks a little bit more haphazard. Therefore haphazard means irregular, of course. So basically that's what we see with this dense irregular connective tissue. We also have what's called dense regular connective tissue. Now this is going to make irregular become a little bit more apparent. Once I show you what dense regular connective tissue is, you'll say, now I get it. Now I get it. And basically what happens is you have all those collagen fibers, and they're dense, they're closely packed together, but they're regular in the sense that they're in line. Okay, they have nice even lines. Okay, so if you're very uh, anal, then what happens is you like things to be perfect. You want things just to be just exactly right. I'm a Virgo, so excuse me about that. But everything likes to be nice and in a dense but regular order. There has to be some order to it. So you have regular parallel arrangement of these collagen fibers as compared to the last time. They seem to be all a little squiggly all over the place. Where do we find this? Areas where we need a good amount of strength, such as in ligament. Ligament holding, which will help to guide as well as prevent abnormal motion around joints. Tendons, which join a muscle to a bone, as well as an aponeurosis. An aponeurosis actually usually connects to things really well. The top of the scalp basically connects a muscle in the front to a muscle in the back. The frontalis muscle in the front with the occipitalis muscle in the back by a dense connective tissue that goes over the top, and that's called an aponeurosis. Okay, so it provides a lot of strength. Why? Because we have all these fibers that are lined up parallel to each other, and they're cross-bridged between all of them. Provides a lot of strength. Okay, so areas where I need a lot of strength, good. That's where we want all these dense regular connective tissue. Okay, and that's what we see. If we look here at these images right here, you see how those fibers line up quite parallel to each other, and they're closely or densely packed. Okay, and this is just another image. If you look over here, here's tendon. If I'm looking at the tendon, I see all these squiggly lines in here. This is all squiggly lines. See how close they are? And if you look over here, you can see these little squiggly lines, all these squiggly lines all over, and they're very close together. How much free space do you see? In dense connective tissue, I see less ground substance, more fibers. They're very tightly packed. But what I still see, few cells. Cell, 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 cell. They're sort of like scattered around. All the pink stuff we see in both of these images, that's all my dense connective tissue fibers. Very little amorphous ground substance, very few cells. And that's what we see, again, when we need a lot of strength. So this is just tendon. This is ligament. We see the same thing. See all these little parallel fibers. They're all running together each other, and all these little parallel fibers, if you look really close, see them all here? All these elastic fibers are in there. There's all those little collagen fibers that are all over the place. Little dots are the cells. And again, you see few cells, lots of fibers, and not much matrix, actually not much amorphous ground substance. Okay, so that's what we see with that. That's ligament. We also have another type of a dense connective tissue, which is pretty regular, which is also called elastic connective tissue, and this is mostly elastic fibers. We see this in some areas in the lung. Okay, the trachea, the bronchi, the airways, and stuff like that. The vocal cords, arterial walls. Arterial walls need to stretch a little bit when the blood goes through, and you feel that pulse. The stretch, we have a little stretch of the wall, so that the wall of the vessel, the arteries, has to be a little bit elastic. Okay, some ligaments that allow a little bit more motion might require more of this elastic connective tissue, which allows stretching. Okay, and it does so because now, if you look at these little squiggles here, instead of being sort of like straight parallel lines, they're squiggly lines. Like I said before, it looks like, if you look at a pan of lasagna from the side, you see all the little squiggly lines all over, and that's what you see. Let's look at a better picture. See all the little squiggly black lines in there? That's all that connective, that's all those fibers. But basically, and because they are wrinkled like that, if I take a wrinkled and I pull this way and I pull this way, what does it do? It straightens out. So that allows that elastic connective tissue to allow in areas where we need a little bit of stretch, like arterial walls and airways and stuff like that, where we need a little bit of stretch. Cartilage. Now, cartilage is a little bit different. Like I mentioned before, cartilage is really a lot of ground substance, a lot of matrix, and very, very few cells, really few cells. Okay, and these cells are actually held in small little lakes. So cartilage cells are called chondrocytes. Chondro means cartilage, cyte means cell, mature cell. And these chondrocytes sit in little lakes, and these little lakes are called lacunae. We're going to see lacunae also in bone, in little lakes, okay? And it's surrounded by this perichondrium, which is basically all this other material that surrounds all these cells, okay? We have a couple types of growth with cartilage. One's called interstitial. Bone actually grows by cartilage. It's not cartilage at the joint surface, but we have growth plates, and these growth plates are actually cartilage. And the cartilage will actually start out and starts to grow, okay, or starts to multiply, and goes through layers, goes through like 5 separate layers until it finally gets to the other end of that growth plate, at which time it's converted itself from cartilage to bone. We also have appositional growth, which means it grows from outside. We'll talk about that later on. We have different types of cartilage and we'll talk about each of those: hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastocartilage cartilage. They all look somewhat similar when I look at them under the microscope, and you'll see what that looks like with these lacunae and stuff like that. Okay, let's talk first about hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the most abundant type of cartilage we have. The thing about collagen fibers, they don't stain well. Okay, when we look at cartilage, okay, we find this hyaline cartilage like in the embryonic skeleton. When a baby's born and you take an X-ray, if you took an X-ray of a baby, you'd say, where were the bones? You don't see a lot of the bone. They're there because what happens is the bones are actually in a cartilage mold that will ossify or convert itself to bone at a certain period of time chronologically. Okay, so we'll find this hyaline cartilage in the embryonic skeleton at the ends of bones, okay, over the joints, in the nose. The cartilage in those, in respiratory structures like in the airways and stuff like that. It's flexible, okay. It allows movements at joints and provides a good amount of support, okay. So that's what we see with this hyaline cartilage. So if I look at that again, you'll see these cartilage cells are the chondrocytes. Like here's a chondrocytes, and it's surrounded by a lake. The lake around is called a lacunae. Okay, we see a little picture here. Let me show you a better picture here. Now this is what we're talking about. If you see something looks like this, you know it's going to be cartilage. Okay, and what you see is all this is that ground substance, everything in here. But what happens if I look here? There's a lacunae, and inside the lacunae is a chondrocyte. Here's a lacunae. Inside the lacunae is a chondrocyte. Okay, here's a lacunae, and inside the lacunae is a chondrocyte. Okay, so all these little open areas here are these little lacunae, or these little lakes, and inside the little lake is a chondrocyte. Same thing we see over here. Okay, here's a lacunae, chondrocyte sitting in there. Lacunae, chondrocyte sitting in there. And this all in here, everything else is all that ground substance, is all that matrix that's around. So this is, just take a look at this. All these other cartilage images will look very similar to this in regards to a lot of matrix. And these cartilage cells are chondrocytes in these lacunae, and that's called hyaline cartilage. Okay. The other type of cartilage we have is called fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage is like found in the pelvis, where the front of the pelvis comes together at what's called the pubic symphysis, as well as the discs between our vertebrae. Is basically this fibrocartilage. Collagen fibers stain in fibrocartilage a little bit darker. Okay, and we'll see that on some of the images here. The menisci, which are basically pieces of cartilage between joints. We have a meniscus in our shoulder that deepens the socket on the scapula, and we have a menisci that are on the top of the tibia, or the larger lower leg bone. They actually deepen the socket, so the femur with the ball ends of the femur, the condyles of the femur, can actually fit in a deeper socket. Okay, and that's where we see this fibrocartilage. Provides some support, strength, rigidity, and fuses well with bone and other things like that. So this is basically fibrocartilage. Okay, and we see a little bit of difference here. You still see lacunae with the chondrocytes sit inside, but you start to see how some of the fibers stain a little bit darker. See a little bit, you can start to see more darkness in here in this fibrocartilage. Okay, so if you which are basically all those fibers that are in there. We didn't see that in the hyaline cartilage before. So this is basically what we see with fibrocartilage. Again, still has that lacunar image with the lacunae, the lakes, and the chondrocytes inside. But now the fibers that are in between, they stain a little bit different, and as compared to hyaline cartilage, you actually see them a little bit more. Okay. Third type of cartilage what we have is called elastic cartilage. Now, they say remember elastic cartilage by the 3 E's. The epiglottis, which is a little flap at the back of my tongue. So when I swallow food, the epiglottis flaps over the top of the trachea so I don't get food down the trachea. The eustachian tube. The eustachian tube is actually a tube from the back of my nose that goes to the middle portion of my ear that keeps the pressure behind my eardrum equal to the pressure on the outside. Okay, equalization, as well as the external ear. You know, the flappy portion of my ear. Okay, provides some support, maintains shape. You know, another type of cartilage. And again, we still have our lacunar structure with the chondrocytes inside the lacunae. There's a chondrocyte, lacunae, and stuff like that. Look at this image here. This is what we see here. Okay, it stains a little bit darker. A lot of times on the prepared stains that we saw, that you'd see if you were in the lab, these stain exceptionally dark, all that ground material between all that. But what you do is you see, here's the lacunae. You probably see more cells here and more lacunae than you see in either the fibrocartilage or the hyaline cartilage. But here's a lacunae. Let me do it in a different color. Maybe you can see a little better. There's lacunae, and chondrocytes inside the lacunae. A lot more, you know, and then we have some amorphous ground substance in between, matrix between. So that's called elastic cartilage. Now, bone is also a connective tissue. Bone's also a connective tissue. I like bone. We're spending a lot of time on bone. The majority of the radiographs that are obtained are probably on bony structures. Okay, so we'll be spending a lot of time talking about bone structure, and stuff with upcoming videos, as well as a number of the PowerPoints that talk a lot about bone. Bone is basically again, less cells, more ground substance. So basically we have minerals, mineral salts, and collagen fibers, which form what we call the matrix of the bone. Okay, and again, I'll show you some images of what the bone looks like. The bone's also surrounded by the periosteum, which is on the outside, which actually is interesting. We'll talk more about the periosteum. The periosteum is like a membrane around the outside of the bone, and the periosteum has what are called osteoprogenitor cells. Osteo means bone, progenitor means forming. They're actually able to help in forming bone. I'll talk a lot about the periosteum when we get to the bone section a little bit later. Okay. Also on the inside of the bone, there's called endosteum, which is on the inside canal of the bone, which also is osteoprogenitor. What we find in bone is very similar to the arrangement that we saw in cartilage, in the sense that we have osteocytes. Osteo means bone, site means cell, that also sit in lacunae or legs. Okay, bone growth is appositional. Okay, it grows outward in rings. And when we look at bone, it's sort of like a tree. We start out with a certain width of the bone. It gets wider and wider and wider and wider, because what happens is we lay down concentric rings outside the other ring, and outside, and it gets more and more. And a lot of that's because of that periosteum. Bone grows in length only at the growth plates, which is basically is cartilage, like we talked about earlier. Okay, and that's where that comes. What does bone do? It provides support, protection, assists in movement, because what happens is movement requires a muscle taking one bone and moving it towards or away from another. Okay, which provides that movement. The bone actually stores a lot of mineral and energy. It's a site of red blood cell production in certain parts of the bone. In the fetus, as well as in young kids, a lot of the bone could actually form red blood cells. However, in us old guys, basically that's really dwindled down to only a couple areas in my bone marrow that's actually able to make blood cells. Okay. It stores minerals. I'm going to ask this later on when we get to the osseous. And talk about bone or osseous lectures. I always ask students, what is calcium most important for? And most people say, oh, for strong bones, Guess what? You're wrong. Okay, calcium is more important for muscle contraction, nerve conduction, and things like that. We need that calcium. And if my calcium levels in the blood that allow this muscle contraction, nerve conduction, and stuff like that, if the calcium in the blood will support that. If the calcium in the blood levels go down, guess what it does? It takes the calcium out of bone. So the bone's a storage area, and yes, it does get benefit by becoming stronger by the calcium being stored in the bone. But if I need it for other more important things, such as muscle contraction, cardiac muscle really requires a lot of calcium. Nerve conduction is involving a little bit of calcium. If I need it in other areas, guess what? I take it out of the bone, because the bone's a secondary area. So we store that calcium in the bone. Okay. So what does bone look like? This is exactly what bone looks like. I'll show you some better pictures. And what happens is, see all those little black dots in there? Okay, it's hard to tell because, yeah, little black dots in there. All those little black dots, they look like they're in rings. Okay, those are the osteocytes. Those are the cells. Those are the bone cells. Everything else is that matrix. Now, those bone cells also sit in those little lakes called lacunae. So here's lacunae. And the lacunae, it's interesting. The lacunae actually connect one lacunae to all these other lacunae on the osteocytes by small little canals called canliculi. And what happens is it allows materials to get nutrients and stuff like that to get out to those areas. And I'll show you what that's like in a second here. This is what we're talking about. So this is a little bit of bone. And if we look at bone, bone actually occurs in like these cores. If you look at, like, there's a core right here. Here's a core. Here's another core right here. Comes down. Another core comes down. You can see what I'm talking about. They occur in cores. And this is called the Haversian system. Okay, the Haversian system. And right down the center, this is going to help you when you understand it later on. Right down the center of the Haversian system is basically a canal. It's called the Haversian canal. That Haversian canal. And this Haversian canal is a canal for blood vessels and nerves and stuff like that to go through that little canal. You can see how the blood vessel comes from the outside, and then what happens is it goes through these what are called Volkmann's canals to connect one Haversian system to another. See how it's connected here, how it's connected here, it's connected here, it's connected here, connected here, stuff like that, from one to the other, from the blood supply that comes from the outside. Okay. What happens is it's in a core, and right up the center of that core is where I have that blood vessel and stuff that comes right through the center. What happens is, if I looked up at the top picture here, that would be that core, that Haversian canal right here, and the blood vessel will be coming up through there. What happens is nutrients and stuff like that then can leak out of the blood vessels. They go down these little canliculi. Let me get to a smaller little thing here. They go down the little canliculi, and as they get down the canliculi, they get into these lacunae. They're able to supply nutrients to the osteocytes inside those little lakes or lacunae. Then what happens is that lacunae has little wiggles, little canliculi that goes to another lacunae that provides nutrients, also removes waste as well. And then another little canliculi that goes to another lacunae. So all these little, if you look at there's all these little dots in here all over the place. Those are the cells, the osteocytes. Okay, see osteocytes, and they're arranged in a circumferential ring around a central Haversian canal, which would be that area right in the middle. Okay. Now, this is a great picture of bone, okay? Here's that Haversian canal. This area right here, here's that Haversian canal. And that's where that nerve, artery, vein, lymphatics run through the center. And all these little black dots out here, you see around the outside in strings, okay, are basically all the osteocytes sitting in lacunae, in all those little lakes. And all those little squiggly lines you see coming out this way that connect lacunae are the canliculi. And you can see those all here, all these little canliculi that connect one lacunae to another. Okay, and that's how bone is. And then, so I'll have a core, and they'll be outside another core, outside another core, outside another core, and the bone will grow in width that way. Okay, and that's because it's laid down in these circumferential rings. We'll talk about different types of what I call lamellar arrangement of bone. We talk a little bit more about bone, but basically the cell that we see here, is not this. That's where the blood vessel stuff is. This area, that area, that area, that area, that area, that area, that area, that. All the little black dots are the osteocytes sitting in those little lacunae. This is an exceptionally great image of what you see. osteocyte and lacunae, osteocyte and lacunae, osteocyte and lacunae, osteocyte and lacunae, on and on and on. Now, one last thing I want to mention in regards to connective tissue is blood, okay? And blood is also a connective tissue, okay? Is also a connective tissue. And what I did that in red. That was appropriate, I guess. And what happens is if I look at it, it makes sense. Because blood are cells, they're in a liquid matrix, and that liquid matrix is what we call plasma. Plasma is all the liquid area. If you take blood and stick it in a tube, and you put it on a table and let it sit overnight, when you come to it and look at it the next morning, what happens, the cells, because they have weight, fall to the bottom. Just like if you're walking across a creek and you kick up a lot of mud, if you come back a little bit later, the water is going to be clear. Why? Because that sediment, that's all the mud, the dirt cells will actually fall to the bottom because they have weight. So what happens is blood has a matrix, and the matrix is what we call plasma. It's the liquid portion. Most of the chemicals that are transmitted through the blood are transmitted through the plasma, with the exception of like oxygen. Oxygen actually binds to a molecule in the red blood cell called hemoglobin, and most of the oxygen, about 98.5% of it, is carried around on the red blood, inside the red blood cell. But most of the other materials, like all the electrolytes and stuff like that I have, and plasma proteins, other types of chemicals are actually in the plasma. So basically, the cellular portion of blood are different types of cells. We have what are called erythrocytes. Erythro means red cells. Okay, red cells. We have leukocytes, and I did a white line there. Okay, you can't see it because it's white. Okay, see, that's pretty clever. Leukocytes, leuko means white cells, and different type of white cells like I talked about before, as well as platelets. Platelets are actually small little chunks of material. They come from what are called megakaryocytes. Megakaryocytes are large cells. They actually break up into little clumps, and these little clumps are actually sticky, so they will actually cause, stimulate the clotting function. We'll talk about that later on, okay? So blood provides the transportation of various materials, such as these chemicals, like I talked about, assist in immunity, because what happens is white cells, particularly lymphocytes, particularly T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes, B lymphocytes making antibodies, T lymphocytes being eaters, okay? They allergic reactions and allergic responses by a lot of these eosinophils, which we see increase in allergy, as well as the basophils, which have histamine. Phagocytosis. Phago means eat. Cytosis, eating cells. These are cells that eat things. Bacteria, all kinds of other crud and stuff like that that are in the blood, as well as the blood's important in clotting, like we talked about. Okay, and we have different types of blood cells. Let me just show you a better image. I love this picture. I absolutely love this picture. I don't know if it's real or not, or if it was reproduced this way, but I love it because it shows everything I need to know about blood cells. Okay. I mentioned there are 5 major types of blood cells, white blood cells, 6 types of cells, and 7 types of different things. Okay, you see this little, let me just do it smaller here. See that little thing up there? That little thing is a platelet. And if you looked at the blood, there'd be all these little clumpy things all over the place in the platelets, because it comes from a large cell that breaks up in fragments, and these become sticky. So if I have a little hole in something, that little platelet will stick to there. And then what it does is, once that platelet sticks there, it makes a little plug. It releases chemicals that draws other clotting factors that will actually cause a clot. All these things right here, these are all red blood cells. These are all red blood cells. And you see how they look pale in the center? The reason why they look pale in the center is because they are not round cells like that. They're not spheres. What happens, if I looked at them from the side, they're called biconcave discs. So if I looked at them from the top, they look round, but they're dark around the outside and very, let me do it this way. They're dark around, they're dark around, come on. They're dark around the outside. And paler in the middle. The reason why they're paler in the middle is that area is where it's thinner, right in the middle, like that. So this area up in here would be because it's redder, because there's more and there's less in here. It's thinner, so that's why it's dark. Why it's lighter in the middle and dark on the outside. And those are what we see. Those are called erythrocytes. Erythrocyte, erythrocyte, erythrocyte. Erythrocytes are in the millions per cubic millimeter. Millions per cubic millimeter. What happens is so I know what a platelet is now, and I know what an erythrocyte is. Let's look at this cell right here. Okay. Now that darker purple area in there is the nucleus, and this nucleus has lots of different forms to that, and therefore this is called a PMN, polymorphonuclear leukocyte, or also called a neutrophil. Neutrophil. Has small little granules in it. If you look at sort of granular, if you look at the cytoplasm, because everyone knows the cytoplasm, if you look at the cytoplasm, it looks granule. Those are granules that they don't stain very dark or anything like that. They're sort of like very mediocrely stained. They're neutral. They're not really, they don't stain red, they don't stain blue. They're neutral. And that's how we see that. So that's called a polymorphonuclear leukocyte. That's what we see right there. Now this one right here, okay, it's almost that. It's almost a neutrophil. This here is called a band. Guess why they call it a band? Because in a polymorphonuclear, poly means many, morpho shaped nucleus. Okay, I see lobes. I see at least 3 to 5 lobes of that nucleus. Here I have one nucleus. So it looks like a horseshoe, or looks like a what? A band. Instead of lobes, it's a band. This is an immature neutrophil. It's not quite where it needs to be. It's not quite mature as well. It doesn't work as well. If you look at the cytoplasm of this one right here looks very similar to the cytoplasm of this one right here, with this very pale, very neutrally colored granules inside the cell, and basically they look the same cytoplasmically, but what happens if you look at the nucleus looks different. This cell right here, usually in the case of infections, they're putting out lots of white cells, and the bone marrow says, hey, I don't have enough of these fully mature guys, I'm going to send some of my younger people out, and they don't work quite as well, but they're called bands. Okay, so basically that's a polymorphonuclear wannabe. It's a young polymorphonuclear cell. This cell right here, or let me go to this one here first. That cell, which is about the size of a red blood cell, maybe a little bit bigger, is called a lymphocyte. Now, lymphocytes could either be T lymphocytes or B lymphocytes. There's a lot of discussion now about all this when we talk about all the immune problems going on with COVID. And what happens is these cells could either be T lymphocytes, which are basically, and both of these are involved in immune function. Lymphocytes are involved in immune function. What happens, I can tell a lymphocyte because I have very little cytoplasm, which is the purple, lighter purple, and a very large nucleus. If I have a very large nucleus, little cytoplasm, and a little bit bigger or almost the same size of a red blood cell, it's called a lymphocyte. Okay, and T lymphocytes are eaters. They will go out and they will start to eat things. And B lymphocytes, like I mentioned before, actually create some memory of what's called an antigen. Antigen's an abnormal thing that the body knows it shouldn't be there. And what the antigen does is it causes what's called an antigen antibody reaction. And what happens, these B lymphocytes actually, and T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes look the same, okay? But they have different chemical structure a little bit when they look at the surface of them. But B lymphocytes basically mature into what are called plasma cells, and plasma cells make antibodies, okay? This cell right here, which is bigger than the lymphocyte, but it doesn't look like any of those cells, this is called a monocyte. Monocyte. And these are indiscriminate eaters. They just love to eat. Okay, they eat a lot of stuff. Basically, they munch a lot of garbage. Okay, they munch a lot. Probably about 50 to 70% of the white blood cells in the blood are going to be polys. About 20 to 40% are lymphocytes. Okay, we'll have a few percent that are monocytes. These eaters. That leaves me 2 more. This one right here, over here, is called a basophil. Basophil. And because what happens, if you look at all these granules, they're dark purple, the dark blue. That's because when they stain it, these granules turn blue. These actually have histamine in them. So they are histamine, okay? And other types of what are called vasoactive substances. There's a very small percentage of basophils. We shouldn't see too many basophils in the blood. This one right here, if you look at the granules look red. And this is called an eosinophil. Eosinophil, and that's because when they stain it, the granules are red. Basophil blue, eosinophil. Eosino means red or rosy. So eosinophils stain red. We see that that number of cells increase. Oh, this is really complicated. Look at the slide now with all these little drawings. Hopefully you'll be able to follow that. But these eosinophils are there. We see it in parasite infections or allergy. And that's when we see the two biggest rises of eosinophils. Anyway, that's what we see. I love this slide because if I erased everything that was here, okay, if I erase it, it's all gone. It's all going to be gone in just a minute, hopefully. Get out of there. Almost, okay. It shows everything. It shows platelets. It shows red blood cells. It shows neutrophils. It shows immature neutrophils or bands. It shows lymphocytes. Okay. It shows monocytes. It shows basophils. It shows eosinophils. Everything you need to know about blood. So erythrocytes up here, platelets, bands, neutrophils, eosinophils. So red blood cells, erythrocytes, platelets, neutrophils, bands or immature neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, basophils, eosinophils. Love it. It's a great slide. Okay. Now this is probably more of what you'd normally see. See, this is like a peripheral smear. There's a neutrophil right there. There is a lymphocyte sitting right there. Here's a clump of platelets. But what do I see mostly? I see mostly erythrocytes or red blood cells. What do I see over here? Here's a neutrophil. Here's a band, which is becoming a neutrophil. Here's a lymphocyte, but mostly I see red blood cells or erythrocytes. That's what we see. Again, millions of red blood cells to thousands of white blood cells. Okay, per cubic millimeter, we'll see millions of red blood cells. Per cubic millimeter, we'll see anywhere between 5,000 to 10,000 white blood cells, and that's about it. And that's all the different types of white blood cells altogether. So what have we talked about today? We talked about connective tissue. We know connective tissue is tissue that, connects. There are lots of different types of connective tissue. And the thing that sort of differentiates connective tissue from the epithelial tissue, like we talked about before, where epithelial tissue had a lot of cells that were tightly bound together and tightly packed, connective tissue has fewer cells. They're spread out with a lot of the stuff in between, which is called the matrix. That matrix is built from two things: ground substance, which are a bunch of chemicals and materials like that, as well as fibers. And these fibers are mostly collagen or elastic fibers that fill that gap between that. So fibers plus the ground substance results in what we call matrix. Lots of matrix, fewer cells when we talk about connective tissue. Okay, whether that be bone, whether that be blood, whether that be ligament, tendon, cartilage, whatever the case may be. That's what we talk about connective tissue. So hopefully all this makes sense to you. And I think connective tissue, again, is, you can see why it's the most common, because it's everywhere. I mean, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. So that's a little bit about connective tissue. If you have any questions, as like all the other ones, please feel free to ask. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you might have. Talk to you later. Be safe, be healthy.